They were started under the Carter administration.
They were, and
completed under the Reagan.
Oh, they were not. They were stalled under the Reagan
doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter.
No, it does matter a great deal. Question of who favors these things and on what merits. But
there's no doubt that Carter did the heavy lifting on deregulation.
thank you.
But in any event, I'm not trying to defend one political party or another. As David says, a major enemy of a free market is a business interest. The business community is a major enemy. The problem in the society is to have the public at large understand the importance of free markets so as to protect themselves against the depredations of the business community with their tariffs, their quotas, their special provisions, and so on. But if you come to all of these good things that society is supposed to do, you have to look at how many of them have been perverse in their influences and their effect. You mentioned the FDA, and that's a very important case because that's caused tens of thousands of lives over the course of time because of the evidence has been. Go ahead.
I mean, you can start with the AIDS virus, where the FDA tries again. Recently, there have been reforms, but they were very slow to let people, even people who knew they were going to die and were going to die without any drug, to try experimental drugs.
Let me ask another question.
You'd have to establish that those experimental drugs would have, in fact, saved their lives.
They couldn't have done worse. They were going to die.
Let me give you another hypothetical. What if you have a social need, say a disease which is very lethal but affects very few people, and you don't have a company who has an interest because it's not going to make very much money, there's not a large market for the good, to produce a drug? Does the government have any role there to step in to try and stimulate certain social purposes?
It's hard for me to imagine. I can't imagine how the government would in the first place.
But in any event, you must realize that government isn't the only recourse.
Yeah.
The great period, when were the nonprofit hospitals of the United States founded? Almost all of them were in the 19th century during the heyday of laissez-faire. There are private charitable activities, which are essentially the most effective way of handling the kind of things you've described.
Yeah. Right.
A little bit of faithfulness to history surely would cause you to concede that in 1937, when we inaugurated Social Security, in 1965, when we inaugurated Medicare, we did so because the private charitable systems, the private insurance systems to care for people when they were old and when they were sick were failing in a gross way to meet the needs of the American people. And those programs, which are government programs, have at least had the virtue of extending the access to health care and extending income security when you're old to a very, very large part of the population that never had it before. And I would argue, too, that in addition to the regulatory functions and the judicial functions that we certainly agree on, that there is in a rich society which can afford to take care of people who fall out of the market process, who aren't lucky or gifted or fortunate in their economic lives, to take care of those people when they are old and when they're sick.
But what about the extent to which the same society that you described, the same logic that you described, makes them poor? What about the minimum wage, which prevents many people from getting employment? What about the rent controls, which destroy housing in the cities? And you're trying to look at...
I'm beginning to switch over. You can point to the minimum wage, which everybody agrees increases unemployment, among the poor especially. But what about the environment? I mean, if you have if you have a simple environmental law, I mean, the reason the West is cleaner than the East, the Eastern Bloc, is the main reason is we're richer. We can afford to do it.
The problem, so far as the environment is concerned, the real function of the government is to define the property rights. And it is quite clear that if I force you to take bad water for good water, well, then I ought to pay you. I'm not quarreling with that. But if you look at the actual environmental measures that government takes, they often have harmful effects and not positive effects. The new clean air bill that has just been passed, for example, is going to cost an enormous amount of money.
Well, nobody knows how much.
In principle, of course, your argument is one which many economists are sympathetic to, and I have some sympathy for it. But the technical facts of environmental control are such that it is often very, very costly to define the property rights in a way in which you can generate an efficiently functioning market. That is why you don't have a privately organized market. The information cost of those transactions is extremely high. So in some cases, what you want to have the government do is say, if there is mercury in the water, you find out who's putting it in and you shut it off.
But let's look at what the government...
That's a reasonable way to proceed because the alternative is extremely costly.
But let's look at what the government actually does. In the United States today, the federal government spends an amount of money which is 25% of the national income. State and local governments spend an additional 17% of the national income. That's 42% altogether. Now, some of that is doing good, of course. It'd be very hard to spend that amount of money. But an enormous amount of that is simply taking money from some and giving it to others, and very often taking it from poor and giving it to well-to-do.
Right, now, you're counting, of course, Social Security in that, which is taking money from the payroll tax from working people and transferring it to the world.
On the whole, so far as Social Security is concerned, the people who pay are poorer than the people who benefit.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you for watching Free to Choose. Next week, we'll be discussing what happens when government enters the marketplace.
When anyone complains about unfair competition, consumers beware. That is really a cry for special privilege, always at the expense of the consumer. What we need in this country is free competition.